On the Paddle Monster Race Director Series, we're joined by Anthony Vela. Anthony's career spans elite level racing, high performance coaching, and a decade plus, almost 2 decades of production at the highest level of paddleboarding. From all the way back from Battle of the Paddle to the ISA World Championships, like you've helped shape the trajectory of this whole sport. So we'll dig into what's going on at this nationals, but basically right now you're now at the helm of this year's U.S. Surfing SUP and Pro National Championship. So like just to start off with the basics, like can you walk us through the event, the location, dates, formats, like what paddlers should know about it?
Sure. Great to see you, John. And first of all, I want to say that I'm not at the helm of the event. I'm just helping out USA Surfing, who's at the helm, and they are, the event directors. I'm just, stepping in and helping facilitate the race side. So
Yeah.
this event is the U.S. Championships for parasurfing, for shortboard, for longboard, for kids, also for stand-up paddle surfing, and this is also the U.S. Championships for racing as well. So originally, this event, the dates are June 13th is the SUP surfing, June 14th is the racing, Saturday, June 14th. All through the week in Oceanside, California, in the South Jetty. There, you can go down there. You'll see parasurfing, you'll see shortboard surfing, longboard surfing, and for some of these disciplines, it's qualifying for some of the international events. And also for the racing, there's a qualifier for the ISA SUP and Paddleboard World Championships. So there's two components to this USA Surfing event. There is the US qualifying events that are for people like Connor Baxter and Candace Appleby and Soren Preston and Campbell Carter, and these are just some of the people who have qualified in past years for SUP racing and also for prone racing. So there's the qualifying events that there's a 10K distance race and a 3 kilometer technical race in and out of the surf. But also a couple of years ago, Candace Appleby had the idea to have an age group national championship built into this already existing event. So now the event is comprised of a distance race, which is 10K for the age group and for the US qualifying event. There's then later in the afternoon is the technical portion where there will be four heats total: men's prone, women's SUP, and men's SUP.
That sounds amazing. Can you talk about the technical course and what that's like? Is it very much like a traditional battle the paddle type of style event or?
Yep, there's very little paddling if
Yeah.
there's surf. The only time you're paddling is to get out through the waves and then to kind of cut across the back to spread it out so you can come in on the other side. So it's a 3 lap course that goes in and out of the surf, and it's to qualify athletes for the ISA World SUP and Paddleboard Championship, which typically is in surf as well. And so the event, I mean, it's so exciting on both the prone and the sup side. And it's 3 laps, and each lap is 2 times in and out of the surf. So you can do the math. There's plenty of time for some awesome action and for some thrills and spills as well. So I always encourage the age group paddlers to come to participate in the age group race, but then make sure you have the rest of your late morning and early afternoon free to watch these elite athletes going in and out of the surf. I mean, there really isn't anything better than watching, Connor Baxter and Candace Appleby go through the waves at a very difficult wave, which Oceanside is.
That sounds amazing. I mean, you've been through, coming from the athlete side of it into
Mhm.
the organizer side, into the support side now, like what, from your experience, what do you bring as far as like, what shapes your approach to these races as far as, like coming from somebody who's actually like got ground into the shore break and, had to make those buoy turns and stuff like,
Yep. So I, as a coach, you want to put your athletes in a position to succeed. as a race director or organizer, I want to put the athletes in a position to succeed. And so the if you take the Pacific Paddle Games events, and those events, were designed to create a format so that these athletes can ride waves and showcase, what they can do, and not just like a mash 'em up derby sort of thing. So with this USA Surfing National Championship, I well, one, I take being an athlete into trying to make things as fair as possible in the race director side of it, right? So, things like false starts and things that in other sports they adhere to these practices, in an effort to kind of get our sport to from like this, hey, let's go race on a weekend to, hey, let's actually have rules. Let's have a way to enforce them, and then let's actually enforce them because I feel like that's the most fair thing. So, from an athlete, I didn't necessarily want people to be able to start earlier or boards going between my legs and things like that. I wanted to let my paddling and my surf knowledge do the talking. So, in and out of the waves makes it fun. And I feel like more times in and out of the waves rather than long laps lets the skill side of the athlete come out and showcase, hey, how good are you in the surf? Well, let's put you in and out of the wave several times versus having a shorter time in the surf and a longer paddling. The 10K, that's the time to show off your paddling, and then the technical and out of the surf race is the time to show off your skills.
Now, is the distance race something that's going to be easy to get to the start and the finish? So if they're not exactly comfortable with going in and out of the surf, it's not something that prevents them from getting into that race?
Yeah, that's a great point, and Oceanside's a great spot because, well, the event's changed location the last couple years. So it was originally at the North Jetty, and the age group race started outside the waves, so people could use the harbor to paddle around.
Mm.
Last year it was at the pier because they were doing some dredging, so we couldn't have it there. You couldn't use the harbor to paddle all the way around because it was pretty far, but it still started outside the surf. So you had time to kind of wait for a lull and use the rip currents instead of everyone just going at once. The good part about this year is next to rocks, there's always rip currents. And so it makes it a little bit easier for the athletes to get out. And again, this year, we're going to start in the water, but they'll have 15 or 20 minutes to go from the sand to the start line and
That's
can kind
great.
of make their way out to the start line in between sets during a lull. And coming in, well, anyone can get pushed in, right? So, and again, from an athlete's perspective, obviously you want to ride a way in. From a safety perspective, you want to be as safe on the way in. So we go over things like, hey, remember the hand helmet to prevent your board from hitting your head, try to stay away from people. And so as the race director, I go through some of these safety things to make sure everyone makes it in safe. And then obviously the boards are expensive. And so staying away from people is always a good idea. And I like to remind them that.
Yeah, I mean, when you were talking about the rules to make it fair, there were a lot of situations where either people had confusion in other races or they didn't hit a buoy the right way or in the right direction, or, what kind of rules have you brought into this to make it a little bit more fair? Or is it just about communicating the rules clearly and letting them know that we are absolutely enforcing them as opposed to like this general, these are the rules, do what you need to do to finish?
Yeah, it's a hard thing to do. It's one thing to have a rule, it's another thing to enforce the rule.
Yeah.
And in order to enforce the rule, you're not going to make any friends. And back the first year of the Pacific Paddle Games, the waves were huge, and I didn't design the course. I was just executing the design of the course. And it was very, pinched in, and one of the buoys was very difficult to navigate, and there were so many people. And I have course officials out there, and there were a few people that missed the buoy because there was a wave and then
Yeah.
there's a collision, and so they just go. But if we see them not go around the buoy, well, you didn't do the course as designed, so that's a disqualification. And having to be the one to go tell somebody that you've traveled and you're disqualified, that's not the easiest thing to do. At the USA Surfing National Championships, fortunately. There's not as many people to make it so impactful. as was the Pacific Paddle Games and these huge events. Because it's the U.S. Championships, only U.S. citizens are allowed to participate, and because it's going for that USA qualifying spot, it makes it a little bit easier to enforce these rules. Now, on the international stage, that's a completely different story.
Yeah.
And we have, of course, officials that have been working in their various locations throughout the year on their own events. And so we all come collectively together to try and have the rule clearly defined and then have a way to enforce it. But in the end, it's me going to tell the athlete and or the manager that the athlete has been given a penalty or disqualified. In Denmark this past year, because there was no waves, there were a lot of rule violations in the technical race specifically because there were so many turns for each lap. And we had judges on all the buoys, and of course, no one's gonna. And it's new, this whole enforcing of rules.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
so the athletes, it's great to see when you go watch the replay. I invite everyone, go watch the men's and women's replay of the technical race in Denmark, and you'll see athletes pausing because they're all skilled. John, they're all very, very skilled. So when you go between somebody's legs on a turn, I believe that these athletes can prevent it. And when you watch some of the turns, you'll see them stalling and preventing it from happen. But inevitably, it does happen because nobody thinks the rules are going to be enforced. So that part of it has been very difficult. There were, like I said, a significant amount of rule violations in Denmark. The previous year in France, there were several. But then I feel like the athletes learn because the last year in Denmark, the technical race was earlier in the program, and then the sprint race was the last race of the whole program. And you
Yeah.
would think, boom, 100 meters out, 100 meters back with a turn, that's where the rule violations would occur. But by then, there had been a number of violations. So there was only, and I'm trying to remember how many heats, upwards to 50 heats, there was only one rule violation. And I was pretty excited about that, and
Progress.
it shows the athletes are learning about the rules.
Yeah, because I remember in the beginning, a lot of the races, they didn't want to enforce them. They wouldn't enforce them. And I think a lot of the races had started doing $100 protest fee. So if you wanted to, you had to call out your competitor for breaking the rules. You had to have a witness, and you had to put $100 up before they had the awards to be able to protest it. So was all this bad will? I mean, I know from the Carolina Cup and even the Battle of the Paddle, there were times where like you would say somebody did something, but then somebody else would have a camera. They're like, yeah, and your guy did this 4 times, and she did this on this corner, and she did this on and then so you're like, okay, wait a second, we're not, whether it was a sandbar and people running across, or sometimes there's proximity rules where you have to be within 50 yards of a jetty or a buoy or this, just for navigable, like channels and stuff staying in and out. But
Right.
in the beginning it was almost like it was not frowned upon, but basically it was like, don't complain, get out there, do what you need to do, and then but now that we're in international competition, now that we're talking about Olympics, we're talking about, the national championships, the idea that it's more official driven and that everything's on camera and then you can watch that seems like it would be more freeing and kind of make that swell towards, all right, we got to follow this, even if we have to stall so that we don't, break that priority rule or, so I'm glad to see that's getting to be more of the standard. Is there something that athletes, are the rules pretty standard from technical to technical now, or there's still some variations, major variations between events? Is it something they can get used to, in other words, like a few?
Well, in my opinion, the sport's so new, right?
Yeah.
So it's not to say anything against any race or race director or anything. And, I've been in those races where the race director will say, okay, no doing this, and then people do it, and then nothing happens.
Yeah.
Or, I've been announcing events and, I see something that the race director talked about. And, I remember one event in particular where like the race, I don't want to say the race, but Danny Ching was winning the race the whole way, and they talked about, doing the right thing around buoys. The last turn, someone went through his legs, knocked him over, he went down. And Danny's such a good guy. He didn't, make a big stink of it. All he said was like, "Hey, you told us that this was going to happen. I literally led the whole race, got knocked down at the last buoy, and
Yeah.
no one did anything." And I don't. It's just it's hard to enforce rules, and it takes we're all human beings, right? So it's not like we're just, and so it's we want to do the right thing to be nice, and thank you to every single race and race director because it's hard putting on, like putting on an event year after year and having the rule is one thing, but how do you enforce the rule? So you have these long distance races, and how do you have people everywhere? Okay, well, don't go here. Well, is there anybody there watching if people go there? You have a certain buoy you're supposed to turn around. Do you know that people are turning around the buoy the right way? So having the people in place to enforce these rules with the confidence to say, yes, that was a rule violation. That's what I feel like most races don't have the capacity and the personnel to execute this type of thing, right? So you have these rules, well, the athletes get used to them not being adhered to, and so they just react accordingly. And so I think the key for other events is to say, hey, we're not going to have the rule, or we are, and here's how we're going to enforce it. When you're organizing the race, you're thinking about, okay, where do the tents go, all this, and very not so often the race directors are thinking about, hey, how am I going to enforce these rules? Do I have people in place? There's a violation. What happens next? What happens next? What happens next? And that's where I believe that the ISA is taking the sport in a direction that has rules and is enforcing them. The newly formed European SUP league which is run by the European Surfing Association, and they've kind of adopted those rules and actually enforcing them as well. So it's great to see that. I know they've had a couple of events and a couple of rule enforcements as well. So it's tough for the athletes to adjust from race to race where the rules are enforced differently. But you can always know that at the USA Surfing Championships, the ISA World SUP and Paddleboard Championships, we're going to have rules. We're going to have the personnel in place, and we're going to do our best to enforce the rules. But don't forget that even in the highest level sports with the most amount of money, referees are humans and they make mistakes also.
Yeah. And it comes down to trust. When you've been training all year for something, when you've taken the time to know the course, to know the rules, to prepare, you want to know that the race is going to enforce the rules so that everybody's on the same playing field, so that somebody doesn't get an unfair advantage that outweighs all the training and talent and all the experience that everyone else has done. So as more race directors take that seriously, enforce the rules, and it becomes the norm of that trust for the race directors and the races, then it becomes less of I feel like a bad person for saying this because it's out of your hands. You don't have to say something because the race directors are there. So, but anyway, that's awesome. That's super important. I'm glad you talked about that because I think, we have such a community atmosphere or something. We like so many people. There's so many different personalities, but there's so many cool people in this. And to be able to say, even if it was Danny the one knocking the person off their board or breaking the rules, maybe if he wasn't aware of it, it's like to say, "Hey, Danny, you broke the rule. You're out," or you get penalized this or whatever. It would be hard. Although Danny would be like, "Yeah, you got me." Like I didn't.
Yeah.
But it does people do have to remember, like you said, that race directors are human and they have to enforce the rules. So that's great. One of the things that I wanted to tap in, because you've seen the sport from, it's surfing roots, and now as it's evolving into Olympic inclusion, and especially with SUPs like Olympic push, and what do you think the biggest hurdle is, or do you think that the surf roots are going to feed into that, hold it back from that? Like, where does that play?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot of people, obviously are talking about Olympic inclusion, and there's different, things that are out there about Olympic inclusion. being part of the ISA, which is the International Surfing Association, that is the recognized governing body by the Olympic Committee for the sport of surfing. And like sports like swimming, swimming has multiple disciplines under the umbrella of swimming. It's got different events. Same thing for track and field. There's the marathon. There's all these different disciplines that are part of the umbrella. So surfing originally, when they applied for Olympic inclusion, it wasn't only shortboard surfing, it was longboard surfing, it was stand-up paddle racing as well. So when they got into when the shortboarding got into the Olympics in Japan, the IOC said, or that time it was actually Japan that said no to SUP surfing, excuse me, stand-up paddle racing and longboarding. And then in France, ISA applied again and was trying to get SUP racing and also longboarding in, and that was also no. LA 2028, this was the closest that stand-up paddle racing and also that longboarding got, because now surfing is an event in the Olympics. It's not an exhibition event, it's part of the Olympic program. And so to add another discipline is easier than adding a whole entire new sport, right? And so this is what has made it a little bit easier and almost getting into LA 2028. The thing is, there's a finite number of athletes. There's 10,500 athletes that are allowed in the Olympics. So we've seen over the years, this sport comes, this sport goes, this sport's added, but they're looking for, it seems from an outsider's perspective of the Olympics, they're looking for new action sports, right? BMX has gotten in, skateboarding's gotten in, speed rock climbing's gotten in. So they're looking for all these exciting sports. And as a surfer and as, someone who got into stand-up paddling when the only best race was the battle of the paddle in the waves, and that's what made it exciting. For me, that's the side of the sport that I enjoy, and that's why I work with and love the way that what the ISA is doing for the sport of stand-up paddling. So I'd like to also say that in 2019, right, or prior to that, ISA proposed for stand-up paddle racing and surfing to be in the Pan American Games, which it was in Peru in 2019. There were four disciplines in surfing: shortboard, longboard, sup surf, and sup race. And in 2023 in Chile, the Pan American Games, sup surfing and sup racing were also included. These are the highest level. This is the highest level that stand-up paddle racing has been on. And some of the South American stand-up paddlers, Itzel Delgado, the Brazilians who have been able, Elena Ribeiro, who have been able to earn medals at the Pan American Games in stand-up paddle racing. That changes their entire athletic career trajectory, because now they're entitled to government funding because they've won a Pan American Games medal, right? It doesn't matter what sport, but it's our sport. And so what ISA has done for stand-up paddling thus far in almost getting it into LA 2028 and getting it into the Pan American Games has been awesome. I think the barrier for our sport, the hurdle right now, is that there's kind of, the sport is in some different directions and it's young. So as a young sport, I think we're doing pretty good. And, once we figure out our direction of the sport or different, disciplines, then, we'll see what IOC does. The good thing is 2032 is in a place that is surf and wave and ocean friendly in Australia. So ISA is already looking towards hoping to get stand-up paddle racing in there.
Well, maybe we'll get some room if they get rid of breakdancing. Maybe that'll be where it comes from. I don't know. No offense to breakdancing, but so I mean, just to end this up, because this has been fantastic and I really appreciate it. For it, there have been so many waves of race directors, the ones that started the initial push and then nationwide, then tried to get a little bit of a tour going. And now there's like this whole other wave of people that are getting stoked on races. And I'm sure there's going to be other venues, like everything from, there's like an explosion in the UK, explosion in Northern Europe, the Midwest Paddle League, there's just so much going on right now. So for those race directors that are like, how hard could it be? Like we've got a bunch of people who want to race. We've got an empty weekend. Let's figure this out. Like, is there anything that you would if for someone who's building a race, like, is there any piece of advice that you could give them to kind of like elevate their race or, help them have the best shot at success?
That's a great loaded question, and I want to thank you. You're talking about me, but you've also helped create the sport with being one of the original founders of the Carolina Cup, and I think using uh, the important thing is that it takes money to run a race. You
Yeah.
need permits, you need safety, you need all these things that you don't really think about when you're doing something out of the goodness of your heart. And my advice to race directors is to not look outside of the sport for the dollars to run the event. If you're looking, think about the brands. They're trying to get the athletes there. They're trying to, the margins on boards aren't very big. There's so many things. Everybody wants a deal, right? So the problem that I see with some races is they're looking towards our sport and towards the brands for the sponsor dollars. Let the brands get there and get their athletes there and participate in helping their athletes with equipment and things like that. But when you can get these out of industry dollars to finance the event, that's going to make the event more sustainable. If you're counting on entry fees or different things like that, and like, okay, I'm going to get 100 people at $30, it's three.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, that's a bad race business model because it's going to fluctuate and you don't want to depend on that. And if there's, you're expecting 100 and there's 50 and you're disappointed. 50 is still awesome. And so if you're using those entry fee dollars as extra money, you're going to be stoked on the 50 paddlers. But when you start depending on those entry fees and when you start depending on the endemic brands, I think that's not the best case scenario. I think a lot of businesses, you see stand-up paddling on TV and all different, ads. Well, if they can spend a $30,000 ad, they can spend 10,000 to, sponsor this event that they can get so much content from. And that's the key is engaging these brands and saying, "Hey, we can get you content for a whole year from being around this awesome race and awesome people." And I think that's the secret for success is to just look outside of the industry, and that's going to help make your event more sustainable.
That's so huge. That's such great advice. You freaking nailed it. I mean, coming from a race director, I mean,
I mean,
I know. I'm like, oh man, that's right. Like, this is, even now with content, like when they go out for a full content day, the idea that they could come out and actually shoot during one of these days, they get content for their brands, or even just the user generated content, kind of. Anyway, but great advice. So last question, like, because you've been in it for a long time, which we keep talking about how long we've been in it, but what keeps you stoked? Because you keep this energy about you with all this stuff. Like, what do you love about this that keeps you in it?
Yeah, that stand-up paddling is just awesome. And, you know, similar to you, like, I paddle all the things that you can paddle. I enjoy paddling everything. If I had, the space and everything, I would have every piece of equipment and, paddle it all. But stand-up paddling is unique because it's sort of a combination of all of these things, right? It's not one thing or the other thing. It's a combination. It brings the balance from surfing and the paddling from other paddling sports, whether it's surf ski or outrigger. The view from above, looking down at the ocean or river or whatever body you're paddling in, is different than sitting at water level on a outrigger or a surf ski, which I enjoy. I'm not saying anything, but it's just a different perspective when you're standing looking
Yeah.
at ocean animals and things. And it's a combination, and it's an awesome community. All of those other communities are great as well. But there's something really cool about the sport of stand-up paddling and so many different places that you can do it. In the rivers, I love river paddling and races and flat water and downwind and but for me it's so challenging to do in the waves and I really enjoy that challenge and I enjoy athletes and normal people who enjoy that challenge of going in and out of the waves. And that's what the USA Surfing Champion National Championship is about. It's like, hey, Oceanside's tough, but back in the day, I mean, the graveyard race, it was tough. That was the draw. It shouldn't be the deterrent. And so I want to get back to that time in stand-up paddling where we were looking for something challenging, like going out through the surf, paddling a challenging course, attempting to catch a wave in, and then hanging out with everyone who went through that same thing as well. So the draw to the sport is that it can be so challenging, and I love the fact that it is, and I love the people that go after the challenge.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate that, and I appreciate you, and thanks so much for your time. And the I wish you the best of luck on the USA Surfing SUP and Pro National Championships. Again, I really appreciate your insights, and it's really good to see you. It's been a minute, so it's awesome.
You
So
too. I look forward to the next time.
yeah, thanks, buddy. I appreciate it. Have a great day.